For 6 years, Sergeant James Harrington had been one of the few black royal guards to uphold the prestigious traditions of Buckingham Palace with unwavering dedication. When he first noticed the woman's racist taunts, it seemed like just another tourist trying to provoke a reaction, the kind of thing that happens all too often during the changing of the guard ceremony. But when she crossed a line by slapping him across the face, something inside Harrington snapped. The choice he made in that moment would shake the very foundations of what it means to be a royal guard, and the consequences would ripple through the halls of Buckingham Palace forever. Comment below where you're watching from today, and if you like this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. The sweltering summer heat bore down on Buckingham Palace as the changing of the guard ceremony commenced. Sergeant James "Jim" Harrington, a black royal guard in his early 30s, stood at attention at his post in the East Gate, feeling the weight of the day pressing down upon him. Sweat trickled down his face, soaking into the thick red fabric of his uniform and the heavy bearskin cap perched atop his head. Despite the discomfort, Jim remained perfectly still, fighting the urge to wipe his brow or adjust his stance. He focused on his breathing, using it as an anchor to maintain his composure and dignity in the face of the punishing heat. The iconic ceremony unfolded around him, a spectacle of precision and tradition that never failed to draw crowds of eager onlookers. The Guard regiment marched in perfect formation, their steps echoing off the palace walls in perfect unison. The regimental band's music filled the air, a stirring melody that seemed to amplify the pomp and pageantry of the occasion. To Jim, it was a highly regimented routine he'd performed countless times, but he understood the charm it held for the spectators. Many saw it as a living symbol of British tradition and the enduring legacy of the monarchy. Tourists clustered around the palace gates and fence, their phones and cameras held aloft to capture every moment of the ceremony. The crowd was a diverse tapestry of humanity, families with excited children, couples stealing romantic glances between the marching guards, and groups of friends from various backgrounds, some local and others having travelled from far-flung corners of the globe to witness this quintessentially British spectacle. Children pointed excitedly, their eyes wide with wonder at the sight of the guards in their resplendent uniforms. Adults murmured in awe of the guards' discipline and poise, marvelling at their ability to remain so still in the face of the oppressive heat and the constant scrutiny of the crowd. Jim, however, had long since learned to tune out the noise and commotion. He trained his focus inward, letting the usual comments and laughter from the crowd fade into white noise. His purpose was clear: to maintain decorum and order, serving as both a symbol and protector of this cherished national tradition. The heat continued to build as the changing of the guard ceremony began, but Jim's resolve never wavered. As he stood there in the far east wing, ramrod straight and unflinching, Jim couldn't help but thought of the countless hours of training, the grueling physical and mental challenges he'd overcome to earn his place among the elite royal guards. He remembered the pride he'd felt the first time he'd donned the iconic uniform and the sense of responsibility that came with it. This wasn't just a job for Jim, it was a calling, a chance to be part of something greater than himself. His introspective moment was abruptly interrupted by a piercing voice slicing through the silence. "Hey, Black One, can you give us a smile for the camera?" The words, heavy with condescension, were unmistakably aimed at Jim. In the crowd, a blonde woman held her phone high, her face a blend of amusement and disdain. Jim's training kicked in immediately, his face remaining impassive as he stared straight ahead. Years of discipline allowed him to maintain his rigid posture and neutral expression, even as the woman's words sent a jolt of anger through him. He focused on his breathing, using it as an anchor to keep his emotions in check. Frustrated by Jim's lack of response, the woman's tone turned venomous. "What's with all this diversity?" she sneered, her voice carrying clearly over the murmur of the crowd. "If they're going to keep doing this nonsense, at least let real Britons wear the uniform." To make matters worse, the small gathering of the tourists around the woman laughed at her comments, their amusement only serving to intensify Jim's growing frustration. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, searching for any crack in his stoic facade, any sign that the woman's words had affected him. The woman, emboldened by Jim's silence, continued her tirade. "Look at him, standing there like a statue. Can't even defend himself, can you?" she taunted, her voice growing louder. "I bet he doesn't even understand what I'm saying. Do you speak English or just whatever they speak where you're from?" The words cut deeper than any of the usual taunts the people had thrown at Jim during his time as a Royal Guard. They struck at the core of his identity, challenging not just his role as a soldier, but his very right to be black and British. The anger that had been simmering within him began to boil, threatening to break through his carefully maintained composure. "Oh, come on," the woman exclaimed, her voice dripping with mock disappointment. "Not even a twitch. Maybe if we poked him with a stick, he'd move. Anyone got a stick?" She laughed at her joke, looking around at the crowd for support. A man standing nearby chimed in, "Leave him alone, he's just doing his job." The woman rounded on him, her eyes flashing. His job is to stand there and look pretty for the tourists, and he can't even do that right. Look at him, doesn't even fit in with the others. The woman's taunts continued, interspersed with laughter from some in the crowd. The heat of the day, which had already been oppressive, now seemed to close in around Jim, making it hard to breathe. Sweat trickled down his back, and he could feel his hands growing clammy around the rifle bayonet inside his white gloves. But still, he remained motionless, a living statue in the face of adversity. The woman's loud remarks and mocking tone quickly drew more attention, as onlookers began to hush her for disturbing the solemnity of the ceremony. A nearby security guard, noticing the escalating commotion, stepped forward to defuse the situation. He approached the blonde woman, his stance calm yet authoritative, handling the matter with professional firmness. "Ma'am," the security guard said, his voice calm but authoritative, "I'm going to have to ask you to step back and respect the guard's space. They're not here for your entertainment." The woman turned to face the security guard, her expression a mixture of indignation and amusement. "Oh, come on," she scoffed. "It's all just a bit of fun. No harm done, right?" The security guard remained unmoved. "Ma'am, I understand you may see it that way, but you caused a disturbance during the ceremony. These guards have a job to do. They're a vital part of our national heritage, and we ask that all visitors show them the respect they deserve." For a moment, it seemed as though the security guard's intervention might have the desired effect. The woman took a step back, followed by a young boy by her side. The crowd around her began to disperse slightly, some looking embarrassed to have been associated with her behavior. Jim, still standing at attention, felt a small measure of relief. While he couldn't show it outwardly, he was grateful for the security guard's intervention. It was a reminder that not everyone shared the woman's prejudiced views, that there were still those who understood and respected the dignity of his position. However, the respite was short-lived. As soon as the security guard walked away, the woman resumed her place at the front line behind the fence and taunts him, this time raising her voice even louder. "Hey you, black one," she called out, her tone dripping with mockery. "You blend well with that hairy cap. Can't see anything except your eyes. Ha ha! Show us your teeth so we can tell you're a real person." Her laughter rang out sharp and cruel, and to Jim's dismay, some of the nearby tourists had joined in again. They chuckled uncomfortably, caught between their own discomfort and the woman's apparent amusement. The young boy that had been trailing the woman's side, about 10 years old, watching Jim with wide-eyed curiosity. He leaned closer to the fence, tugging on the woman's sleeve. "Why doesn't he smile, Aunt Haley?" the boy asked, his voice filled with innocent wonder. "He's just standing there, not doing anything." Haley huffed in exasperation. "Because he's a Royal Guard, you idiot," she snapped at the boy. "They're not supposed to move no matter how funny or hard you bother them." "But why does he wear that funny uniform if he's a guard? Why is his hat so big and fluffy? It looks really hot." Haley scoffed, rolling her eyes at her nephew. "Don't be stupid, Daniel. It's just for show, you nitwit. To make tourists like you gawk and take pictures." Daniel tilted his head, still watching Jim intently. "But Aunt Haley, why does he look so serious? He's not smiling at all." Haley sighed, clearly annoyed by the questions. Because he can't think for himself, she sneered. He's been told to stand there and look stupid, so that's what he does. Use your brain, Daniel. The boy frowned, clearly struggling to reconcile his aunt's words with what he was seeing. But what if he needs to go to the bathroom, or if he gets thirsty? Haley let out an exasperated groan. Oh, for heaven's sake, Daniel, that's enough. The blonde woman snapped. If you're so fascinated, why don't we see if you can make him move? I bet he's not as disciplined as he pretends to be. The white ones are better at holding their posture, I've heard somewhere. Emboldened by his aunt's behavior and the lack of response from Jim, young Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of peanuts from his snack. With a mischievous grin, he selected one and tossed it towards Jim, watching with fascination as it bounced off the guard's polished boot. Jim's expression remained unchanged, his eyes fixed straight ahead, but inside he was in turmoil. The peanut incident, seemingly trivial, was the culmination of years of racism he had faced, now boiled down to this careless act by a child who didn't know any better. It fueled his inner struggle, bringing to the surface all the doubts and frustrations he had been suppressing. The disturbance intensified as Haley's voice rose and the boy tossed more peanuts through the fence. A black woman, seemingly a local, stepped forward, urging the boy to stop loitering near the palace and advising Haley to keep him in check. This sparked an argument among the crowd, further escalating the chaos of the scene. From inside the fence, Major Timothy Hall, Jim's superior who had been passing by, approached. "Is there a problem here, Sergeant?" Major Hall asked. His tones firm and authoritative. Jim's voice was as steady as his posture when he replied, "No, sir, no problem, sir." But even as he spoke the words, he felt the weight of the lie. There was a problem, a deep systemic problem that went far beyond this one incident. The security guard outside, noticing the escalating disruption, made his way back toward Haley, addressing her with a firm tone. "Ma'am, I've already warned you once. The guards are not here for your entertainment. If this behavior continues, I'll have to ask you to leave." His gaze then shifted to Daniel. "And you, young man, keep your hands off the fence. If I catch you tossing anything else inside the palace grounds, I'll ensure you and your—" "Aunt," Daniel interjected quickly. "Your aunt will face a fine, and trust me, you won't like that." Haley huffed and rolled her eyes, but ultimately backed down. Major Hall, satisfied that the situation was under control, casually walked away. Yet this brief moment of resolution only intensified Jim's inner turmoil, leaving him even more unsettled. As he stood there, outwardly calm but inwardly seething, Jim's thoughts drifted inward. His mind wrestled with the deeper significance of his role. Did the uniform he wore truly symbolize an outdated tradition, as the woman's taunts suggested? Or could it stand for something greater, a Britain that included and respected all its citizens, regardless of their background? The oppressive heat of the day showed no signs of abating as the ceremony continued. During a momentary lull in the proceedings, young Daniel turned to his aunt, his face flushed and his expression one of boredom and discomfort. "Aunt Haley," he whined, "I'm bored and it's so hot in here, let's go." Haley, her patience wearing thin, seized upon this opportunity to continue her provocation. "Oh, Daniel boy, you're right. This blackguard is a boring sight," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "But you know what? He's only boring you because he's the fake guard. Look over there, those royal guards were the real ones," she added, gesturing to the formation further down the line. Jim's jaw clenched imperceptibly at these words, his resolve hardening even as he fought to remain silent and unresponsive. As the procession approached the center of Buckingham Palace, the crowd shifted, moving in the opposite direction to secure a better view. Amid the bustling movement, the woman, Haley, a name Jim had now memorized from her interactions with the boy, grasped Daniel's hand, pulling him along with a rough tug. In the sudden commotion, Daniel's treasured toy guard figure that resembled Jim's uniform slipped from his grasp, landing inside the restricted area close to Jim's post. "My toy. My royal guard," Daniel cried out, his voice filled with distress. He tugged urgently at his aunt's sleeve. "Aunt Haley, my guard fell over there. Can you get it for me, please? Hayley, clearly annoyed by the boy's whining, rolled her eyes. Oh, for heaven's sake, Daniel, it's just a stupid toy. Forget about it. The real procession's there and you don't want to miss it. But Daniel was inconsolable. Please, Aunt Hayley, it's my favorite. Dad gave it to me before... His voice trailed off, choked with emotion. Hayley let out an exasperated sigh. Fine, if it'll shut you up. She turned her attention to Jim, who was still standing motionless at his post. Hey you, blackguard. Be useful for once and pick up that toy. You know I'm not allowed in there. Jim remained silent. His training and sense of duty prevented him from breaking protocol, even as Hayley's demands grew more insistent and abusive. What's the matter? Are you deaf as well as dumb? Hayley sneered. I said pick up the toy. It's right there at your feet. Or are you too important to help a child? Daniel, caught between his desire for the toy and his discomfort at his aunt's behavior, spoke up timidly. You said he's not allowed to move, Aunt Hayley. Ah, Hayley huffed, her tone laced with irritation. Why does everything have to be so difficult in this heat? Watch and learn. Without further warning, she glanced around, noting that most of the crowd had shifted toward the front gate, and seized the moment. She climbed over the fence, slipping into the restricted area. Striding directly toward Jim, her face twisted with a mix of anger and prejudice, she closed the distance, disregarding both the rules and the solemnity of the place. What kind of guard are you? She spat, now standing uncomfortably close to Jim. Too good to hand over a toy? Or maybe you're just following orders like a good little soldier, no mind of your own. Jim remained motionless, but inside he was battling a storm of emotions. The woman's proximity, her blatant disregard for protocol, and her racist taunts were pushing him to his limits. Hayley, frustrated by Jim's lack of response, made a fateful decision. She raised her hand and in a shocking move slapped Jim across the face. There, let's see you ignore that, you moron. The sound of the slap echoed in the sudden silence that fell over the crowd. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, something inside Jim snapped. Years of training, of discipline, of turning the other cheek, all of it fell away in an instant. He grabbed Hayley's arm, pinning her to the ground with a swift, practiced movement. In the same motion, he raised his rifle bayonet, his voice ringing out with authority. Halt! The echo of Jim's voice sliced through the air, loud enough to command attention from the East Gate's surroundings. His gaze remained locked on the woman's piercing blue eyes, as a few onlookers close enough to witness the scene gasped quietly. Though most people around the area hadn't noticed the incident, this small group, curious and unsettled, began inching closer. The atmosphere quickly filled with the faint clicks of camera shutters and occasional flashes from phones as these few bystanders tried to capture the tense moment. Daniel stood frozen, eyes wide with shock and fear, his beloved toy guard completely forgotten amid the sudden confrontation. Noticing the cameras pointed her way, Hayley's demeanor shifted abruptly. She began to wail dramatically, her voice rising to a shrill, pleading pitch. "Oh, please, I'm sorry, spare my life. I only fell over the fence trying to get a good picture of you," she cried, her exaggerated performance seeming genuine to those unaware of her earlier conduct. The camera flashes and Hayley's sudden change in tactics breaks Jim's focus. His grip loosened and his rifle bayonet fell to the ground with a clatter. Realizing what he had done, Jim released Hayley, stepping back in shock at his own actions. Seizing the attention of the small crowd, Hayley's expression shifted to one of feigned helplessness. "Please," she whimpered loudly for all to hear, "can you help me get back over the fence? I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding and for climbing the fence. I won't do it again. You see, sometimes I get confused and do things not supposed to be done." Words keep spilling out of her mouth, anything to save herself from the situation, but Jim was deaf to her pleas. Reluctantly, he held back his frustration, maintaining his composure under the watchful eyes of the onlookers. Gesturing to the East Gate, he escorted her calmly along the perimeter, guiding her away from the restricted area. When they reached the gate, Jim opened it, allowing her to step through. Just as she crossed the threshold, Haley cast him a fleeting, triumphant look hidden behind her apologetic expression. Without warning, she spat on his shoes, a subtle, defiant act that went unnoticed by the crowd, but its intent was clear. Jim held his ground, his expression stoic, as she rejoined Daniel, who stood nearby, wide-eyed and confused. Haley thrust the toy guard figure into Daniel's hands. "That's how you do it, boy," she whispered, and patted him on the back. "You don't let anyone push you around, not even these royal guards." Jim stood rooted to the spot, facing the judgmental stares of the onlookers. Some looked shocked, others angry, and a few seemed confused by the rapid turn of events. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the silent accusations in their eyes. In that moment, Jim realized that his actions, regardless of the provocation, had crossed a line he had sworn never to cross. The situation quickly descended into chaos. Several bystanders, disturbed by what they had witnessed, alerted a nearby security guard, who approached to assess the situation. As word spread, the crowd gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony gradually drifted toward the commotion, drawn by conflicting accounts of the incident. Voices clashed as people shared their versions, some defending Haley's act as a misunderstanding, while others condemned her behavior, creating a ripple of tension and curiosity that spread through the spectators. Some onlookers argued vehemently in Jim's defense. He shouted, "Halt!" first, one tourist explained to a security guard. "That woman was harassing him all day. She even slapped him." Others, who hadn't witnessed the full extent of Haley's actions, were quick to condemn Jim. "He attacked a civilian," someone shouted. "Is this how the royal guards behave now?" As arguments raged on, Major Timothy Hall approached Jim from inside the fence. His face was a mask of disappointment and bewilderment, clearly struggling to reconcile the impeccable soldier he knew Jim to be with the scene of disorder before him. Before Jim could offer any explanation, Haley's shrill voice cut through the commotion. "He assaulted me," she shrieked, her earlier bravado replaced by a performance of victimhood. "I only wanted to get a good picture, and he attacked me. This is outrageous." Major Hall, balancing the need for protocol with the importance of preserving the solemnity of the procession, made a quick decision. "Sergeant Harrington," he commanded in a low, controlled voice, "you're relieved from your post. Follow me to my office immediately." Without waiting for a response, he turned, trusting the security guard to manage the woman and the dispersing crowd. Jim gave a brief, respectful nod, then stepped away, leaving the scene behind as he followed Major Hall, the murmurs of the crowd fading into the background. When they reached Major Hall's office, Jim attempted to explain the full sequence of events. "Sir, I need to tell you exactly what happened." "I don't want to hear it, Sergeant," Major Hall interrupted sharply as he closed the door behind them. "It's hard to believe a woman would go as far as jumping the Buckingham Palace's fence simply over a toy. Stop making excuses." "But, sir, you saw her earlier, making racist remarks and disturbing the peace," Jim countered, his voice tense with frustration. Major Hall's gaze hardened as he regarded Jim. "Shouting provocative words and jumping over fences are not connected, Sergeant Harrington. Enough. Your duty was to maintain composure and discipline, regardless of the provocation." His tone was steely, leaving no room for argument. "Do I make myself clear?" Jim clenched his jaw, suppressing his response as he nodded, tension simmering in the silence between them, thick and unresolved. "I'm disappointed in you, Harrington," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "You know better than this. Hand over your uniform and rifle. You're suspended pending a full investigation." The weight of Major Hall's words hit Jim like a physical blow. He had sacrificed so much to wear this uniform, to serve with honor and distinction. Now, in the span of a few chaotic minutes, it was all being stripped away. As Jim changed into civilian clothes, he felt a wave of defeat wash over him. The uniform he had worn with such pride now lay folded on Major Hall's desk, along with his career, his dignity, and everything he had worked for. He walked out of the office feeling naked and vulnerable, acutely aware of the eyes that followed him as he made his way out of the palace grounds at the East Gate. Outside, Jim scanned the crowd for any sign of Haley and Daniel, but they had vanished, swallowed up by the flow of people. In the distance, the ceremony was winding down, yet in the brief span of its 45 minutes, everything felt altered. What had begun as an ordinary day had spiraled into something deeply unsettling, as if the routine patterns of his world had been quietly, irrevocably disrupted. Standing alone amid the crowd, Jim felt the weight of change settle over him, marking the end of a personal era. The changing of the guard ceremony, with its customary 45 minutes of pomp and pageantry, had come to an end. A fresh shift of royal guards assumed their posts, ready to stand watch for the next 48 hours. The afternoon sun still blazed overhead as Jim sat on a bench outside Buckingham Palace, the events of the past hour pressing heavily on his mind. Now, with his uniform and position stripped away, he felt unmoored, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly in the space of a single ceremony. The crowds from the ceremony had mostly dispersed, but there was still a steady flow of tourists milling about the palace grounds. Jim sat unnoticed among them, no longer the center of attention he had been just a short while ago. As he grappled with the consequences of his actions, Jim noticed a familiar figure approaching hesitantly. It was Daniel, the same boy who had been part of the group taunting him earlier. The child's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and uncertainty, clearly not recognizing Jim without his iconic guard uniform. "Excuse me, sir," came a small, trembling voice. Jim looked up to see Daniel standing before him, eyes wide with worry. "Have you seen a blonde woman with blue eyes about 5 feet tall? She was wearing a purple crop top and long jeans." "No, leave me alone, boy," Jim replied coldly, his voice edged with bitterness. The thought of helping anyone connected to the woman who had cost him his job felt impossible. I'm lost, sir. That woman's my aunt. I came here with her to watch the procession, but I can't find her anywhere. Can you help me?" Jim looked away, unwilling to meet Daniel's gaze, resentment simmering beneath the surface. "Please, I don't know my way home. My aunt and I lived in the suburb and we rarely visited London," Daniel pleaded, tears seeping into his voice. "Can you stay with me until we find my aunt? I'm scared." Jim looked at the boy, torn between the impulse to walk away and a lingering sense of duty. He glanced around the area, searching for any sign of Haley, but she was nowhere to be seen. The afternoon was wearing on, but there was still plenty of daylight left. Sighing heavily, Jim finally nodded. "All right, lad, we'll find her." As they started walking, Jim's voice softened but held an unmistakable edge. "Just so you know, I'm doing this because you're a minor," he muttered, the hurt clear in his tone. "You were tossing peanuts at me earlier, remember? That's part of the reason I lost my job." Daniel looked up to study Jim's face immediately, a flicker of guilt soon crossing his features. Jim glanced at him briefly, noting the boy's remorse but keeping his focus on the path ahead, determined to see this through despite the bitter taste it left in his mouth. You're the guard, the one my aunt was yelling at?" Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. When Jim nodded, the boy's face crumpled and he looked down, clearly overwhelmed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to get you in trouble. I just—" Daniel stuttered, struggling to find any explanation for his or his aunt's behavior. His mouth opened and closed as he searched for words that wouldn't come. "You just didn't know better," Jim finished quietly, his tone softer than before. The boy's remorse was evident, and though it didn't undo the damage, it softened something in Jim, a small glimmer of understanding passing between them as they continued walking in search of Haley. "Why did you become a guard?" he asked suddenly, looking up at Jim with genuine interest. Jim considered the question for a moment. "I wanted to serve my country, to be part of something bigger than myself," he replied, his voice tinged with a mixture of pride and sadness. "I thought standing guard at the palace was a way to protect our history and traditions." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. It looked really hard standing so still for so long, especially in this heat. "It takes a lot of practice and discipline," Jim admitted, "but that's part of the job." As they continued their search, Daniel opened up more. "I've been staying with Aunt Haley since, "Since my parents died," he said quietly. "It was a plane crash. Aunt Haley doesn't really want me around, I think. She's always angry or ignoring me." Jim felt a pang of sympathy for the boy. Despite his earlier role in the day's events, Daniel was clearly a child in need of guidance and care. "That must be very hard for you," Jim said softly. "But that doesn't excuse bad behavior. Respect and kindness should never be sacrificed for approval or attention." Daniel nodded solemnly, clutching his toy guard figure tightly. "I understand. I won't do it again, I promise." As they walked, Jim found himself reflecting on his own journey. He thought about the challenges he had faced growing up, the mentors who had guided him towards a path of service and honor. In Daniel, he saw a child at a crossroads, capable of either following in his aunt's footsteps of prejudice or choosing a better path. "You know," Jim said as they walked, "being a guard isn't just about standing still and looking impressive. It's about honor, duty, and protecting what's important. Every person, no matter where they come from or what they look like, can embody those values." Daniel looked up at Jim with newfound admiration. Do you think I could be a guard someday?" Jim smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through him for the first time since the incident. "If you work hard and treat others with respect, you can be anything you set your mind to." As they continued their search, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the palace grounds, Jim realized that this interaction with Daniel was giving him a new perspective on his own situation. Yes, he had lost his job, but perhaps there were other ways to serve and make a difference. The uniform didn't define him. His actions and values did. Suddenly they heard a commotion coming from the far corner of the west gate of the palace. Jim's instincts, honed by years of service, immediately went on alert. "Stay close," he told Daniel as they moved towards the source of the disturbance. As they rounded a corner, they saw a sight that made Jim's blood boil. There, harassing another blackguard stationed at the furthest side of the gate, was Haley. Her voice hurling insults carried across the open space, filled with the same venom she had directed at Jim earlier. "Hey you," Haley shouted at the impassive guard. "What's the matter? Can't you smile for the camera, or are you just another fake guard like the last one?" Jim felt a surge of anger course through him. The earlier confrontation had cost him his job, his dignity, and nearly his self-control. But now, seeing another guard subjected to the same abuse, he knew he couldn't stand idly by. He had to act, but this time he would do so without the constraints of his uniform. He strode was as wide as his feet allowed, prepared to confront Haley. "Excuse me," Jim said, his voice firm as he approached Haley. "I think that's quite enough." Haley turned, her face twisted in a sneer. "And who do you think you are?" she spat. "This is none of your business." Jim stood his ground, his posture straight and dignified even without his uniform. "Actually, it is my business. I'm the guard you harassed earlier, the one you got suspended." Haley's eyes widened as she recognized Jim, a flicker of a victorious grin flashing across her face before settling into a smirk of bravado. "Oh, it's you," she drawled, her voice thick with disdain. "I see, now you can talk. Come to cause more trouble, have you?" Her gaze was sharp, mocking, as if she held all the power, dismissing any hint of remorse. Jim felt his jaw clench, but he steadied himself, reminded of the boy standing anxiously beside him. "No," Jim replied calmly. "I've come to tell you that your behavior is a disgrace, not just to the royal institution, but to your young nephew as well." He gestured to Daniel, who stood a few paces behind, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. Haley's face flushed with anger. "How dare you lecture me about my nephew? You know nothing about our situation." "I know enough," Jim countered. "I know that a child deserves better than to be taught hate and disrespect. I know that the uniform these guards wear represents something far greater than your narrow-minded prejudices." As Jim spoke, he noticed curious people closing in around them, drawn by the confrontation. Among them, he spotted a familiar face. Major Hall, who must have been on his afternoon break after the ceremony. That's the only explanation to see such figure outside the palace gate. Major Timothy Hall pushed his way through the gathering crowd, his face a mask of stern professionalism. His eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of concern and curiosity as he took in the scene, glancing from Jim to Haley and finally to young Daniel. "What's going on here?" Major Hall's authoritative voice cut through the tension. Standing tall in his immaculate uniform, he was a stark contrast to Jim in his civilian clothes. "Jim, I dismissed you from duty pending judgment, and now you're here stirring up trouble. Does honor mean nothing to you?" Jim straightened instinctively, old habits refusing to fade. "Sir, yes, sir. This woman," he gestured calmly toward Haley, "is harassing another Black Royal Guard." Major Hall's gaze snapped to Haley, who quickly dropped her smug grin, replacing it with an expression of feigned innocence. She widened her eyes, adopting a sweet, almost childlike tone as she spoke. "Sir, I don't understand the fuss," she said, clasping her hands together. "I only wanted a picture with the Royal Guard. I didn't mean any harm." She threw a quick, practiced glance toward the onlookers, as if hoping they'd buy her act. Jim clenched his jaw, watching her performance with a mixture of frustration and disbelief, while Major Hall's expression remained unreadable as he took in the contrasting accounts. "Honor means everything to me, sir," Jim said, his voice steady. "That's exactly why I can't stand by and watch this woman undermine it, tarnishing our tradition with her slender and prejudice." Before Major Hall could make his mind, Daniel stepped forward, his small voice trembling but determined. "It wasn't his fault, sir," the boy said, looking up at Major Hall. "My aunt. She jumped over the fence earlier to grab my toy. She slapped him first." Major Hall's eyebrows rose in surprise. He turned his gaze to Haley, who was now sputtering in indignation. "That's preposterous," Haley exclaimed. "You can't possibly believe the word of a child over an adult." "He's telling the truth," Jim added calmly. "After the slap, she abandoned Daniel in the crowd. I was helping him find her when we came across her harassing another guard." Major Hall's expression hardened as he processed this new information. He looked at Daniel, his voice softening slightly. "Is this true, young man?" Daniel nodded vigorously, his face scrunched with remorse. "Yes, sir. Aunt Haley was saying mean things to the guard all day. I was wrong too, throwing peanuts and hanging around the palace when I should have keeping my distance." His voice grew quieter as his face crumpled with shame. "I'm really sorry about that." The sincerity in Daniel's eyes was unmistakable, and in that moment, Jim felt a surge of pride for the boy, touched by his honesty. Jim glanced at him, both surprised and grateful for Daniel's courage in speaking the truth. Major Hall's gaze softened slightly as he looked between Daniel and Haley, clearly weighing the conflicting accounts. The boy's earnest admission stood in stark contrast to Haley's calculated innocence, and the increasing crowd seemed to hold its breath, sensing a shift in the air. Realizing that her nephew had betrayed her, Haley turned on Daniel in a fury. "You ungrateful little brat," she snarled, her face contorted with rage. "I should have known you'd side with him. You're nothing but trouble, just like your parents. I didn't even want you with me. I left you in that crowd hoping you'd get lost." The poison in Haley's voice shocked everyone present, including Jim and Major Hall. Daniel's face rumpled, his shoulders trembling as he realized the depth of his aunt's hatred. Jim instinctively moved closer to the boy, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. Major Hall's face darkened at Haley's outburst. "Madam," he said, his voice cold with barely contained anger, "I think you've said quite enough." Turning to Jim, Major Hall's expression came with a full understanding. "Sergeant Harrington, I owe you an apology. It seems I acted hastily earlier without full knowledge of the situation." Jim nodded, accepting the apology with grace. "Thank you, sir. I understand the position you were in." Major Hall turned to address the gathering crowd, his voice carrying authority and resolve. "If any of you witnessed the incident earlier between this woman and the Royal Guard, please step forward. If anyone has recordings or evidence, we welcome your accounts. The Crown appreciates your honesty and willingness to speak up." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the crowd. Your courage in bringing the truth to light is commendable." Several onlookers exchanged glances, some reaching for their phones while others stepped forward, a few murmuring among themselves as they prepared to share their observations. As the situation began to de-escalate, Jim felt a faint glimmer of hope, a quiet belief that this difficult experience might spark change, not only for himself, but for the system as a whole. Yet, as he looked down at Daniel, who still trembled, shaken by his aunt's cruelty, Jim understood that the road ahead would be challenging. This confrontation had exposed not only the prejudice Jim faced, but also Daniel's vulnerable position, a young boy caught between conflicting values, in need of guidance and protection. While the adults around them deliberated on what to do next, Daniel clung to Jim, seeking comfort in the man who had shown him kindness and understanding amid the chaos. Jim placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's all right, lad," Jim said softly. "You've been very brave today. What your aunt said, that's not on you, you hear me?" Daniel nodded weakly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Jim turned to face Major Hall, his resolve hardening as he spoke. "Sir," Jim began, his voice steady and filled with conviction, "I believe Daniel's home situation might not be safe. Haley's comments reveal a clear lack of care for his well-being. Leaving a child alone in a crowded place like this, it's more than just irresponsible, it's dangerous." Major Hall nodded gravely, his earlier stern demeanor softening as he looked at the distressed child. "I agree, Sergeant, this is a serious matter." Jim continued, "I'm fully aware that this does not fall under our responsibility as the Royal Guard, sir, but maybe Child Services should look into this. Daniel deserves better than to be left alone or treated with such disdain." As Jim spoke, he noticed Haley's face pale, the realization of the consequences of her actions finally setting in. She opened her mouth to protest, but Major Hall silenced her with a stern look. "That's an excellent suggestion, Sergeant," Major Hall said. He then turned to address a nearby police officer who had been called to the scene. "Officer, I believe we have a situation here that requires further investigation." The police officer nodded and stepped forward, assuming control of the situation. After listening to Jim and Daniel's accounts, reviewing Haley's behavior, and assessing the evidence gathered from phone recordings, they determined there was enough basis to proceed. "Ma'am," the officer addressed Haley firmly, "based on the accounts we've received and your own actions, we'll be charging you under public order law. Additionally, we have concerns regarding the child's welfare that must be addressed." Haley's earlier bravado crumbled entirely. "You can't do this," she protested weakly. "I'm his guardian. You have no right." Haley's protests fell on deaf ears as the officers prepared to escort her away. One officer approached with a social worker from the Child Welfare Department, who reassured Jim and Major Hall that they would thoroughly review Daniel's situation. They assured them both that Daniel's safety was their priority and that temporary care would be arranged if necessary to protect his well-being. Daniel, still clutching his toy guard figure, looked up at Jim with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "What's going to happen to me now?" he asked, his voice small and frightened. Jim knelt down once more, meeting Daniel's eyes. "Don't worry, lad. These officers are going to make sure you're safe and taken care of, and I promise you, they're going to find a place for you." "Will I see you again, sir?" Daniel asked in a small, hopeful voice. Jim smiled warmly, reaching to gently ruffle the boy's hair. "I hope so, kid," he replied. "But even if you don't see me in my post here again, you'll always have that guard figurine to remind you. And if you remember the lesson I taught you, then you've already got me right here," he said, tapping Daniel's chest gently over his heart. As Daniel was led away, he kept glancing back over his shoulder, his eyes searching for Jim. Watching him go, Jim felt a surge of complex emotions. There was relief that justice was finally being served, sadness for the hardships Daniel had endured, and a renewed sense of purpose. He had joined the Royal Guard to protect and serve, and today, stripped of his uniform but not his principles, he had done exactly that. Major Hall watched the scene unfold with a thoughtful expression. As the last of the onlookers dispersed, He turned to Jim with a newfound respect in his eyes. "Sergeant Harrington," he began, his tone markedly different from their earlier interaction, "I believe I owe you more than just an apology. Your actions today, both in uniform and out, have demonstrated the virtues of the Royal Guard. Integrity, compassion, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even in the face of personal cost." Jim stood straighter, a habit ingrained from years of service, even as he stood there in civilian clothes. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice steady. Major Hall continued, "What you did today, helping young Daniel, standing up to injustice, and maintaining your integrity even after being dismissed, that's the true essence of what it means to be a guard. It's not just about standing still in a uniform, it's about embodying the principles of honor, duty, and compassion in everything we do." Jim felt a lump forming in his throat, overwhelmed by the Major's words and the sudden turn of events. But Hall wasn't finished. "I'd like to offer you the opportunity to return to your post, Sergeant," Major Hall said, his tone now formal but tinged with warmth. "The Royal Guard needs people like you, individuals who understand that our role goes beyond mere ceremony. We need guards who can adapt to the changing times while still upholding our core values." Jim's heart raced at the offer. Just hours ago he had thought his career was over, his dreams shattered. Now he was being offered a second chance, a chance to return to the job he loved with a renewed sense of purpose. "Sir, I don't know what to say," Jim stammered, uncharacteristically at a loss for words. Major Hall smiled, a rare sight that transformed his usually stern features. "Say yes, Sergeant. The uniform is waiting for you, and I assure you I stand behind you fully. Your actions today have served as a powerful reminder of the true values the Guard represents." With a deep breath, Jim straightened his posture and met Major Hall's gaze. "Yes, sir. I would be honored to return to my post." As Jim walked back into Major Hall's office to retrieve his uniform, he felt a profound sense of renewal. The weight of the day's events still lingered, but it was now tempered by a newfound understanding of his role. He realized that he represented more than just a tradition. His presence in the Palace Guard symbolized resilience, dignity, and a testament to how inclusivity strengthens institutions. Later that day, Jim resumed his post, dressed once more in the red uniform and bearing the rifle bayonet that marked his duty. As he scanned the crowd, he noticed Daniel standing at the edge, accompanied by a different guardian, likely a social worker or perhaps a family member assigned to his care. The boy's face lit up with recognition, and he waved enthusiastically, still holding tightly to his toy guard figure. Jim returned a subtle smile, maintaining his professional composure, but he couldn't ignore the warmth spreading through his chest. In that moment, he realized he had left a meaningful impression on Daniel, perhaps planting a seed of respect and understanding that could positively shape the boy's future. It was a quiet but profound reminder of why he had taken up this role: to serve, to protect, and sometimes to inspire.